Positioning. We will cover two types of positioning, absolute or relative. With positioning, we can specify top, bottom, left, right, and z-index. Let's look at this example. We have a div whose ID is top box, 100 pixels wide, 90 pixels high, and that same fuchsia color we keep using. And this is how all that looks. Okay, what if we add these properties? Position absolute, in other words, we're telling this fuchsia div, position yourself absolutely on the screen at left 200 pixels and top 100 pixels. How do we expect this fuchsia box to move? Let's see. It moves this way. So when we said left 200 pixels, it means leave 200 pixels from your left side. When we said top 100 pixels, it means leave 100 pixels from the top, from your top, and move that way. In other words, move from this very point, 100 pixels down and 200 pixels to the right. If we applied position relative in this example, the same thing would happen. This fuchsia box would move the same way, 200 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down. Let's look at another example. We have three divs, like the previous example, a fuchsia div, a blue div, and a gray div. They have the same height of 90 pixels and the same width of 100 pixels. If we go ahead and give a position relative to the fuchsia box, left 50 and top 50 pixels. Let's see how this box moves. It moves from this point 50 pixels down and 50 pixels to the right, which means when we say left 50 pixels, it means move 50 pixels from this side, which means leave 50 pixels on your left. When we say top 50 pixels, it means leave 50 pixels to your top and move that way. Applying relative positioning to an element keeps it in the flow. The flow is not affected. We discussed the concept of the flow earlier, and in this case, the fuchsia box has a position relative, and the rule is saying applying relative positioning to an element keeps it in the flow. The flow is not affected. That's why the blue and the gray boxes stayed where they are. They didn't move to the top. They didn't become number 1 and number 2. The fuchsia box stayed number 1, the blue box stayed number 2, and the gray box stayed number 3. That's because the fuchsia box did not affect the flow. It was not plucked out of the flow, and that's because it has a position relative. The same example, but now we are applying a position absolute to the fuchsia box and not a position relative. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this is the opposite of the previous slide. We applied a position absolute to the fuchsia box. Indeed, it moves 50 pixels down and 50 pixels to the right, but it is plucked out of the flow because it has a position absolute, and so the second box and the third box become 1 and 2. So the blue div takes its place and the gray div takes the place of the blue div. The rule says applying absolute positioning to an element plucks it out of the flow and the flow gets disrupted. Applying position relative to an element moves the element relatively to where it was and won't break the flow. Same example. Top box is the fuchsia box, middle box is the blue box, and bottom box is the gray box. If we apply a position relative to the bottom box, to the gray box, with a left and top 50 pixels, let's see how this box moves. It's going to move as of this point. That's because the rule is saying applying a position relative, which is what we did, to an element, moves it relatively to where it was, which is this very point, and will not break the flow. So the gray box moves 50 pixels down and 50 pixels to the right. Same example with position relative like the previous slide, but this time right 50 pixels and bottom 50 pixels. How will this gray box move? From which point will it move 50 pixels to the top and 50 pixels to the left? From this point, because we are saying that a position relative moves the element relatively to where it was. It's currently right here. And the reason why I look at this point and not the top left corner this time is because we are applying a right and bottom. So what we do is we look at the right bottom point, and that's where the box moves from. Had this been top left, we would have moved the gray box, or the gray box would have moved as of this point, the top left corner point. But since we are applying the right and bottom properties, the gray box will move as of the bottom right corner. And so it moves 50 pixels to the top and 50 pixels to the left. Applying position absolute to an element plucks it out of the flow, unlike the relative positioning, places it at the top left corner of its parent, if specifying top left, and moves it. Let's see what this means. So we have the same example, and we're still working with the gray box, and this time we are giving it a position absolute with a left 50 pixels and top 50 pixels. What happens to this gray box? The rule is saying that if an element, if a div has a position absolute, it's going to be plucked out of the flow, which means this gray box will no longer be number 3 in the order of elements in HTML, because fuchsia is 1, div, the blue div is 2, and the gray div is 3. So if it's going to be plucked out of the flow, it's no longer going to be number 3. It's going to be plucked out, and it's going to go to the top left corner of its parent. Okay? So the gray will be plucked out and will move to the top left corner of its parent and will move from there. We are assuming that the parent in this case is the screen, is the body element. And we're assuming that because we simply do not have the HTML in front of us, which is telling us otherwise. So unless that is specified, we will assume that the screen, that the whole body, that the whole black space is the parent, right? Because the body element is the parent of all elements anyway, is the parent of the gray box. So the gray box being plucked out because of the position absolute looks for the top left corner of its parent, positions itself there, and moves from there. That's how the gray box moves. So it got plucked out. It looks for the top left corner of its parent. That's because we're specifying top left, and moves from that corner. This is the same rule, except that we're discussing bottom right this time, not top left. So what do you think will happen? Exact same thing, position absolute to the gray box. Instead of saying top left, we are saying bottom right. So assuming that the screen or the body element is the parent of the gray box, where are the bottom and right corners of the screen or of the body element? Here, right? This is the bottom right corner. So the gray box will pluck itself out of the flow since it has position absolute. It will look for the bottom right corner of its parent, which in this case is the body element, and that corner is right here, positions itself here, and moves left 50 pixels and top 50 pixels. Cases where divs are nested in a parent div. In other words, when the div has a parent and not just the body element as its parent. So it's getting more and more complex, but more and more interesting. Case 1. The parent div has position either absolute or relative. So the parent has positioning. Let's look at this example. We have a parent div whose ID is top box. It has two children. The first ID is middle box. The second has an ID of bottom box. And if we have this syntax in CSS, this is what we get. So we have a big parent fuchsia box, which is called top box. It has two children, middle box, which is the gray, and bottom box, which is the fuchsia. We are giving the parent top box, the fuchsia box, a position absolute, and we are asking it to move 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. Let's see what happens. Okay, it moves as of this point, and it takes its children with it naturally, because the children move with the parent. What if we apply a position relative to the gray box, the one whose ID is middle box? Position relative, top 40 and left 40. Let's see how this moves. Before we click on the slide button, let's remember what position relative does. Remember that an element with a position relative applied to it is not plucked out of the flow. So it will move as of this point, right? And the blue will not take its place. So that's exactly what happens.